Hi, and welcome to an early edition of the Basic Bible Breakdown here. I'm your host, Stephen Whitsitt, coming from the comfortable confines of my spare bedroom, and it is 9:41 in the morning and 11/28, 2018. Currently, right now, I'm working on studying for my final examinations for my master's and thesis degree, the last step before I get to finish and graduate. And of course, I have to pass these three exams that they're being brought to me, which so far should not be any kind of problem. And nothing too difficult in that if you know what you've been studying for the last 3-4 years. So last night I posted up a Second Coming Part 3 in Coming Out of Full Preterism Facebook page, discussion and debate page. And as I expected, there would be some comments and some questions and things that came forth from that. I'm just trying to keep it short, and my whole point of that Second Coming Part 3 was to talk about that when Christ comes, it comes to Jerusalem, and what it is that he's doing. And it is based off of Zechariah 12 and 14, and of course with Revelations 20. So with that kind of a background, I want to point out a few things in Zechariah that helps to establish the foundation of what I'm talking about in the view of Christ when he comes and setting up the millennial kingdom, and why I hold to that post-millennial view that, or not a pre-millennial view, why Jeff and Cunningham and others hold to that post-millennial view is what I was thinking. So we're going to be talking about that. And so we get the context from Zechariah 12 and 14, which both by scholars admit and are arguing that they are second coming passages. Now, if the second coming was not during the time of the Maccabees, with Antiochus, Epiphanes, and all that, nor was the second coming during AD 70, we know that for established fact. So 12 and 14 are the ones that give some of the details of what happens when he comes. And I want to look at some specific passages. For example, in Zechariah 12, it starts in verse 2. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. So we are talking about a siege happening. And of course, we're talking about AD 70. That would be when this siege happens. Now, on that day I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for the people, and all who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. And this happened with the Roman armies being involved, come against Jerusalem, but it is also true something in a further point, but I'll bring out a little bit later. Now, for the sake of the house of Judah, I will keep my eyes open when I strike every horse of the people with blindness. Then the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts, their God. Now, does that fit AD 70 description? Can you say the inhabitants of Jerusalem had strength from the Lord? No. Christians all fled. There is nothing but the unbelieving Jew who had rejected Jesus. So why would the Lord of hosts give strength to the inhabitants on that day of his coming? Now, why do I say that all the nations gather against it, but then it's also the second day of his coming? This is based on Revelations 19. In Revelations 19, the armies gather against, when they see Christ return, these nations gather against Jerusalem, and they lay siege to it. But even in Revelation, before it all happens, though, you see that they gather in the valley of Megiddo, and that is where that first battle takes place against the beast and his armies. So it is not specifically at Jerusalem. There is no siege going on at Jerusalem being described in Revelations 19. In fact, it's kind of funny that 17 and 18, they talk about that's the destruction of Jerusalem, the harlot being destroyed and everything else. But yet here you got Christ returning in 19 and fighting against the armies that were sent by God. Something's not right there on that one. Anyway, let me go on here. On that day I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of the wood, like a flaming torch among sheaves. And they, Israel, Judah, shall devour to the right and to the left all the surrounding peoples, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place in Jerusalem. So the surrounding people, the people who come against it, and Jerusalem will remain inhabited and in its place in Jerusalem. And the Lord will give salvation to the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not surpass that of Judah. The glory of the Lord and the salvation will come to Judah and the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Of course, again, that is not describing Antiochus Epiphanes, any time of the Maccabees. It is not describing AD 70 because we know Jerusalem was completely destroyed. There was no salvation for Judah and the house of David or anything else like that on that day. And here's a key verse. On verse 8, on that day the Lord will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so the feeblest among them on that day shall be like David, and the house of David shall be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. And on that day I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. So this whole description of him protecting the inhabitants, of course, cannot fit AD 70. So, of course, the common preterist answers, well, it's talking about the New Jerusalem. I'm sorry. When armies gather against the New Jerusalem after it comes down. That's just, I'm sorry. The New Jerusalem did not come down in AD 70, and then the Roman armies attack. That timeline does not work. And then we get into verse 10, the most famous of verses of there. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. Now, if the context of 12 is talking about his coming on a day to protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem, because there is a siege that takes place, an attack that comes against Jerusalem, and God comes to defend them, and he says, they will look on me whom they what? Pierced, and they will mourn for him. This is not talking about when Christ died on the cross. They're talking about, yes, it is the Christ that died on the cross, but when Christ returns, there's going to be a recognition of this is the one. Grace and pleas for mercy as they look on him whom they have pierced. Who was it that pierced him? It was the Jews who pierced him. It was by their accusations that led to the whole thing. Pilate washed his hands and said, let their blood be on your hands, on the Jews' hands. So they are the ones who pierced him. But here they will mourn for him. And the idea of that is that when they see him come this second time, they recognize who it was that's come. It was the one whom they pierced. They see the hands and the side. They see that he was the one that they had pierced 2,000 years ago. And he is the one who is coming, and they recognize they screwed up. And there will be pleas of mercy, which is repentance. That is all signs of repentance. Of course, this phrase is quoted by John in Revelations 1:7, when every eye shall see him and they will mourn when they look on him. And this also fulfills Romans 11 when it talks about all of Israel was saved, because what will happen is, think about it, if every Jew and every eye sees and they recognize who it is they pierced, it goes on to say every house and every family will recognize this was the Messiah and this is him coming. And whole scale repentance happens with Israel, and all of Israel will be saved. I mean, the whole hope of Israel, even to this day, of course, the believing Jew that still believes in God and still believes in Scriptures, of course, is to see the Messiah come. They still hope for that to happen. And so when this happens, of course, they're going to say, here's the Messiah. And, we missed it the first time, but now this time we're not missing it, and we all believe as one. And it's no different than Thomas. Let me see the hand marks in your hands, and I believe because now I see it. And this is the exact same connotation here, is that when they see that, they too will believe. Now let's skip over to 14, which also is a mirror to 12 in many ways. It says, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall be cut off from the city. Okay, now remember, 12 said what? I will gather and protect the inhabitants. But here it's talking about a siege that happens, and all of Israel is destroyed. Scholars agree this is AD 70. Mark Hitchcock, all of them will sit there and tell you, yes, it's talking about AD 70. But when we have a switch here, because this happened now, something else is going to happen afterwards. After they go off to exile and they will be cut off. It says, then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. So when the Lord fights on a day of battle, like in the New Testament, he defeated his enemies. He didn't play around with them or anything else. He defeated them. So on that day that he comes, and this is the language here, on the day he comes to defend and to deal with these people who have come against Israel, it says, on that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem in the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley. Now, of course, that did not happen in AD 70 because Jesus never came back and stood on the Mount of Olives, and nor was it divided in half. But here it's very specific language that matches with Acts 1. This Jesus who you saw taken up to you will come in the same way as you saw him go. So Christ's return, his feet is going to stand on that. And yes, I take that literally, that he will come back in the same way that he left. His feet were standing on the Mount of Olives when he left. His feet will be standing on the Mount of Olives when he returns. And then further in the last part of the 5th verse, it says, then the Lord my God will come and all the holy ones with him. Now this is also repeated in 2 Thessalonians 3. When they had his coming, his saints will come with him. Now, on that day, there shall be no light, cold, or frost. And there shall be a unique day which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but in evening time there shall be light. Now, there's a suspension of what's going on in the earth when he comes back that affects the physical universe. And that is not far-fetched because we saw many times that things have happened in the past where God, on a day like that, the earth quakes and shakes. On that day, living water shall flow out of Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea, and it shall continue in summer as in winter. So, the living waters, people, of course, spiritually apply to people, and Christianity coming out of that because he comes, and, spiritualize the whole thing. But there's no reason to say the split, because the water, of course, represents the life and the life of the land, and the return to... when Christ returns, of course, life comes with him. But it says on there, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth. And that day the Lord will be one and his name one. This implies that when he comes, that he'll be king over all the... Yes, he's all king over the earth right now in heaven. But are all the kingdoms and the nations submitted to him? No. But when he comes and he defeats all these people... Yes, he now becomes king over all the earth because he's defeated every other king of the earth. And so on that day the Lord will be one and his name one, which means all people will know the Lord and know him and serve him and follow after him in a sense. So the whole land of Israel shall be turned into a plain. Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site from the gate of Benjamin to the place of its former gate to the corner gate. And it shall be in heaven, for there shall never be again a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. Of course, again, in AD 70, the inhabitants were scattered all over the place, as it says in the first 3 verses up there with the siege where the people are scattered and taken into. But here it says that it shall be inhabited. There will never ever be another decree of destruction. So when was the last decree of destruction against Jerusalem? That was presented by Jesus himself, who said that would happen. It happened in AD 70. So on the day that he comes, there will never be again a degree of destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. So that means that Jerusalem has to exist. It has to be inhabited by his people. And of course, on that day, he protects the people that are living there, according to 12. So you have a confirmation here of Jerusalem himself being there, and not being torn apart and ruled and divided and everybody raped and all that. Now, I'm going to get back to a question like Jeff Cunningham and many people have said that, well, on that day, well, everybody in the whole world dies. There's nobody who survives after that. When he comes, all these people, the armies are dead, and all the people are dead, and all the Christians are saved, and that's just the end of it. Okay, verse 16, on the day that he comes, and after the battle has taken place, and after salvation has been given to Judah and to Jerusalem, it says, then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. So, plain and simple, there's going to be survivors. Now, we've got to harmonize that with the New Testament teachings, of course, but it's talking about when he comes, there will be survivors. They will come again, and the survivors have to come year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts. That means they will be paying tribute, they will come to Jerusalem, and they will worship the King, the Lord of hosts, who is living there. This is where I get the idea, the basis for the millennial kingdom. Now, let's go to, and this will take just a second to get my computer over to Revelations 20. Now, the reason I say 20, of course, is that in 19 is when Christ returns and describes the battle and the armies destroyed. And, of course, there were survivors. So, in Revelations 20, now a lot of people take this as a recap. And there's a little bit of a recap in there, but not like what people think. Because, see, when all the activity of the beast was instigated by Satan himself. So now, Revelations 20, let's deal with the cause of the tribulation, the cause of the beast, and all of that. And so we're continuing on in what happens when he comes. It says, after Jesus comes and defeats the army, he sees an angel that comes down holding on in his hand the key to a bottomless pit and a great chain. So he seizes the dragon, the ancient serpent who is the devil Satan, bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into a pit, shut and sealed it over him so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. So here we have a description of that 1,000 years. It begins with Satan's imprisonment and his release, where he's not able to deceive the nations, but yet after he's released, he does. So this is a physical, and I say physical meaning he is restrained. He is now no longer allowed to roam the earth seeking whom he may devour. This is not a binding of his authority. This is absolutely Satan being put into a prison and no longer having freedom to run back and forth across the earth. It ends. That's the language we put in there. Because if even with Paul or anybody, what happens when a person is arrested? They have chains put on them, they're thrown into a dungeon or a cell, and then what? They are bound there for whatever time period that their sentence is due. So he's in a pit, great chain, and then even a rock thrown over so he can't come out. That describes perfectly a jail cell back in the Roman days. I don't see how you can just say, well, his authority is bound. That's simply not true, because really he has no authority in the one sense over Christians whatsoever. He has nothing but the power of his tongue to lie and to deceive people. He has no power over Christians to do anything. So you have to shut his mouth up. That's what it is, and that's the whole purpose of that. Now, directly, he goes up into heaven, and I saw thrones seated on them that were, of course, the whole tribe, from a God point, is what this is. I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image and not received its mark. So this is the recap part. He's going back. So now he's looking, Satan is bound, he's looking up in heaven, and he saw all those people that were killed during the tribulation period, the ones who were beheaded and all of that. And it says what? They didn't worship the beast or the image or anything else. So what happens? They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. Same 1,000 years as Satan is being bound. So it's talking about when he comes, Satan is thrown into the pit, and that's when the resurrection happens. The rest of the dead do not come to life until the 1,000 years was ended. But this is the first resurrection. So when it says the first resurrection, that is the resurrection of the saints that happens at his coming. That's why it is a recap. in that one sense only. So the rest of the dead don't come to life until 1,000 years in. So who is in the first resurrection? The people who didn't take the mark of the beast, all of the Christians, period, who have been living up into this time, the ones who are all resurrected, who became part of his army, the army that came and destroyed the army. And the best picture of that, of course, is this is just awesome. And this is what Tolkien presented this whole picture in the last, not in the last battle, but in the last book, in The Return of the King, when Aragorn comes with the dead on those ships and they jump off, and that army attacks those armies of orcs and kills them all. This is the exact same picture that he's painting here. He saw it the exact same way as I do, that when this dead return, of course we're not that ugly, we are the dead, we are the Christians who are returning with him, and we are the ones who are his army that defeats these armies of the Roman Empire, can't stand against us. So that's the recap there. So this is the first resurrection, and blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death, which is hell, has no power. They are not going to be judged. There's no sense they've already been judged by being changed. That means they were found righteous in order for Christ to change them. God does not take the heathen and automatically change them and say, hey, welcome to the party. It doesn't work like that. Only those who are in Christ are raised. So they will reign for 1,000 years. Now, verse 7. Now when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth. Now when it says four corners of the earth, it's talking about the whole earth. It has to. It's not talking about the four corners of the land. It's talking about the four corners of the earth. North, south, east, and west. Exegetically, that's what you will find all the way through. When it mentions the four corners of the earth, it's talking about the entire globe. East, west, north, south, to the furthest reachers. And then Gog and Magog to gather them for battle, and their number is like the sand of the sea. Now remember, 2/3 of the mankind were all killed during the tribulation period. So here's 1,000 years later, people have repopulated. Now Satan was released, and he again starts to deceive these people, and they come against, and they said, okay, it's time. So they march over the broad plain of the earth, and they surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city. What is the beloved city? It's Jerusalem. No preterist will ever sit there and tell me that Jerusalem is called the beloved city, according to them, prior to his coming in AD 70. It was not the beloved city. It was no, what's the language there? The camp of the saints. When you look up that word camp, that is the idea of a barracks where armies and the soldiers dwell and live together. Jerusalem then becomes the camp of the saints, that beloved city. It's where Jesus is ruling and reigning from. Remember Zechariah 12? They come to Jerusalem year after year to worship the King. Well, it says that once we are gathered, the resurrected saints are gathered, and those who are alive or changed, we are gathered to meet the Lord in the air. We meet him. The battle happens, but we dwell with him face to face in Jerusalem. This is Christ physically ruling on earth with the saints. This is our vindication. Remember, all these men were killed during the tribulation, just, days before when all this starts to happen. And here now that these people that they killed and they beheaded and killed by the beast and these armies, they're now standing and walking around live, ruling with Jesus. Man, this is total vindication of everything that these saints held out for. Their patience being rewarded. I can't think of a more glorious thing than God saying, see, I told you, these are my people, and I was with them. You guys are wrong. These are my people. So that whole language there, they marched across the broad plain of the earth. And of course, I heard preterists sit there and say, well, that's against the New Jerusalem. Well, I'm sorry, the New Jerusalem hasn't come down yet. And when it does come down, there's no marching army that's going to come and march against it. That doesn't going to happen. I don't see how you can sit there and say that the New Jerusalem came down before, and then when all the armies of the beast in AD 70 attacked it, that you're saying that they attacked the new heavens and the earth that are derived with the second coming, and this was the New Jerusalem because the New Jerusalem is made up of saints, and all the saints fled Jerusalem in AD 70. Do you see that? That's inconsistent to say that. With this verse and with what you say in your scenarios, it doesn't work. But when they surrounded the beloved city, it says that fire came down from heaven and consumed them. This is the fire that God is talking about in 2 Peter, the fire that comes down and destroys the world of the ungodly. So all these armies, all these people are being burnt up. All the earth is being burnt up. The saints, all the Christians, were taken off in an instant. This is not a rapture in that sense, or another resurrection. It's instantly this world ends. The devil who was deceived was thrown to the lake of fire, where the false prophets were or are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne, and who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. So all people who have ever lived at this point, automatically, we're all up there in heaven. All of this becomes the second resurrection. All of the rest of the dead who are not raised in the first resurrection, everybody. And this to me is, from Hitler all the way back to Mussolini to every evil person, everybody who has ever lived is now going to stand before the throne and to be judged for what they did while in the bodies. Now, I'm not going to go on through the rest of that, the judgment of the great white throne, but the idea is there, heaven and earth disappear. They flee away. There's nobody on earth anymore after this. Everybody's gone. The whole earth is being burnt up and is being completely destroyed. All the works of man is being taken away. And when we go into Revelation 21, what is happening is this earth is being remade into its pristine state. This becomes the restoration of all things, where God now has done away with the curse. All of those things have ended, and now God is remaking this earth. Because earth was originally created for the place for man and God to dwell together. And that's what it says in Revelations 21 and 20. We will see his face to face. There will be no sun or moon, but it will be God who will light everything up, because he will be with us face to face. So, now let me get back to them with that background of Zechariah 12 and 14 and talking about those things to Jeff Cunningham's questions. And yes, I will tag him in this and let him hear me. So he begins with the questions are, why does he need to come to reign on earth when he is already ruling and reigning over the kings of the earth right now? As I said before, he is ruling and reigning over, but he is not enforcing his will. And meaning you have nations that he's ruling over, but why would God allow the Muslim nations to continue to do what they do and all of that? See, Zechariah 12 says he comes on the earth and his name will become one and he will rule all over. So that implies that his coming, when he appears that second time on earth, he will live in Jerusalem for that 1,000 years to rule over all the nations and all the people. Now, why is it that we have this other 1,000 years? Why is it? Well, think about this. And this is from several different scholars and things. Why is it that he wants to live on the earth, and why does he allow people to get born and raised and lived, and people die, and all that will continue on? Because the survivors, of course, are not being changed. They're not made immortal. So yes, you will have immortal and regular people who are living, breathing, and growing up and dying, and that life will continue on. And of course, this is what's described in the Isaiah 65 and 66, the new heavens, the earth. And that's kind of a misnomer to say that it really is kind of, people haven't really looked at it close enough, I don't think. It is not talking about that new heavens and earth, it's talking about in the millennium. It's a new heaven and it's a new earth when Christ comes here. Satan is gone. He's ruling from Jerusalem. Remember, 2/3 of the earth and the world has been destroyed by plagues, the fish of the sea. All of those things have all been destroyed. But here God comes on here and he starts to remake and peace, where the wolf and the lamb will lie down together. There's no more of that. It doesn't say that the curse is gone at this point, but we're talking about there's a dynamic of the peace that Christ brings into this world with his ruling and reigning over the nations, that they don't longer, they beat their plowshares into, their war machines into plowshares, and their pruning hooks or their hooks and all that into, staffs and things. I'm talking about Isaiah 2 and getting that messed up there, but the point is that there's no more war. People and nations are not fighting against each other. All of those things stop because Christ is ruling from Jerusalem. And this all has to do with not only about the vindication of the saints, but it also has to do with the fact that, think about it, Christ has been gone for 5,000, he appeared for 2,000 years ago, briefly for 33 years. God never lived with man before that, outside of Adam. So now here at the end time, you've got God, Jesus, living here with man like he did with Adam in the garden, living here with him, and it's a kind of a thing of, you haven't seen me, you haven't been with me, you saw me come, but now you don't believe, and I'm never really here. Okay, what does everybody say? Well, if I just saw Jesus, I would believe. The atheist, we have no proof that he exists or anything else. So imagine that this 1,000 years is partially about the fact is, well, here I am. I'm living here. You've asked for this for a long time now. Now here I am. What's your point? Why isn't it you don't believe? Because remember, at the end of that 1,000 years, it's a second army that gathers. It's not the beast that is gathering. It's Satan gathers a second army, another army that he leads against God and against Jerusalem. The deception is from these people who have been watching him and living and growing up in the last 1,000 years, but all of a sudden now here they're deceived. Why is that? And it's because even when people are living with him and see him face to face, know who he is, people are still stubborn enough to reject him and to listen to the lies of the enemy and believe the lies and are deceived by those lies. Satan has no power to force you to think anything. You choose to believe the lies. That's what deception is all about. Adam and Eve in the garden. Eve was deceived by the lies of the enemy. You believe what he says. You entertain him. That's the problem. So, no. Going back to his question, of course, kings of the earth right now. So this is present tense. No, he is not ruling right now over the nations from Jerusalem. That's the bottom line there. He must reign until he puts his enemies under his feet. So when does all those enemies actually come under his feet? All those nations, when does it happen? During that time period. So at the end of that time period, what? That's when everything ends. When all the un-Christians are finally dealt with and they're deceived and their deception and all of that ends, that is when the wicked and all that are destroyed. And of course he wants to call that the parousia, but that is not the parousia because Christ is already here. He's not coming. He's ruling from Jerusalem, therefore he was on earth, therefore there's no sense of this being a parousia. All the dead have already been raised. But he puts both the righteous and the wicked are raised at the same time. But when you read 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15, and especially but 1 Thessalonians 4, it is only the dead in Christ who are raised. That's why Revelations 20 says the dead in Christ will rise first. Then the rest of the dead will be raised at the end of the 1,000 years. They are resurrected to face judgment, not to live again on this earth or to have a second chance. They now face the judgment. So, and that is when death is swallowed up because nobody is being born and living and dying on earth. All that comes to an end. So death is swallowed up in victory. The victory is that Christ defeated all the enemies finally off this earth. Satan himself is now defeated and taken and cast into hell where he will burn forever and ever. So all of these things, so death is given up, the judgment happens, and we come into a new thing. Now, Jeff goes on, at the parousia he hands the kingdom back to the Father. 1 Corinthians 15:24. No, when you go back to 1 Corinthians, it says at the end, he will, when everything is destroyed and when everything is done, that's when he handed it. It never ties in the second coming with him handing over the kingdom to the Father. They do not happen at the same time. That never says that. In 1 Corinthians 15:24. That idea never comes up there. So, he goes on, I think we've been over this before. The millennium is Christ's reign over the earth. He is ruling over all the kings of the earth right now, according to Revelations 1:5. He's reigning from heaven over them until he comes. He must reign until. Our citizen, okay, when Christ returns in his spirit, he will subject all things to himself. And death is part of all things. In fact, it is the last enemy to destroy. Again, this happens at the resurrection. There is only one resurrection. The first resurrection was a spiritual resurrection when you and I were raised to life by Christ and seated with him in heavenly places. Sorry, that is wrong. Revelation 20 says that the first resurrection are those people who were beheaded, the souls that he saw before the throne. They are raised. We, in 1 Corinthians 5, that is not a resurrection. The resurrection literally is the standing again of a dead corpse, of a dead body. That's the literal meaning. The spiritual meaning, because dead people rise, we liken that to the new birth. But a new birth is not even a resurrection, is it? You're being born again. Your old man is not being resurrected back to life. For example, when Lazarus was resurrected, it was the same Lazarus that was buried, and that was the Lazarus that came out. He wasn't a little baby boy anymore or anything else. He was still the same person that he was, that he died. So in the new birth, our soul is in regeneration, is completely recreated, made completely new. So that is not a resurrection. We have died with Christ. The old man died with Christ, and we are raised anew. It's not the old man being raised back up again. The old man is dead, defeated, gone, and all of that. And that's metaphorically. So when you say that first resurrection is a spiritual resurrection, that is simply theologically and unbiblically not true. Now, he goes on. Jesus has already been appointed heir of all things. He is reigning as God's anointed on Zion. And again, what you're doing is you're equating the spiritual with the physical. You're saying it's all spiritual. You're not equating to anything physical, and that's the problem. That's the same problem with Joel Sexton. He wants to define everything in the New Testament and saying that the Old Testament sounds like it's physical, but when we come to the New Testament, all the apostles and everything, when they teach, it all becomes spiritual, and that is simply not true. There is always the spiritual and always the physical. They both go hand in hand, side by side, all the way across. I am spiritually born again, but I still live in this physical body. They exist and coexist side by side. Now, he is reigning over God's anointed on Zion. Okay, you're my son today. He goes on. Of course, that since that time, he's living and reigning and building God's house. When he is finished, he will present her to himself as a pure and holy bride. The wedding feast happens at the parousia. And I agree with that. Yes, the wedding feast. So the parousia happens at the end. After that is eternity in the new earth, with New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, God dwelling with man forever in the new earth, the home of righteousness. So he's putting in there the post-millennial view. And of course, I'm presenting to you the premillennial view. The post-millennial says that the church age is the millennia. So they've got that 1,000 years stretched out to 2,000 years. But the main problem, of course, is that the 1,000 years doesn't start until Satan is imprisoned. For them, they spiritualize that and say, well, that's not actually Satan being imprisoned. That is just the binding of his authority, because Jesus died on the cross. He has bound all authority. He's given that authority to the Christians who can bind his authority. Therefore, he is bound. And that language of imprisonment and being bound are two different things. And that is the mistake. I don't know where else to go with that one. Now, the parousia then will end, the parousia, then the end will come. Yeah, but when he comes, the end, the ending of all things, the last 1,000 years, the last perfect time period before the judgment and all that happens, that is the end. That is the resurrection age, because in that resurrection age, the people who have died have been raised up, they're living back on earth. They are not given in marriage. They don't get married and have children. Do you follow that? That's what Jesus was talking about in that parable. This is the resurrection age. You had the age of the church. The age of the church ends with his second coming when he's here. This begins the third age where Christ, the millennial age is what it is, the millennium, that 1,000 years, when Christ rules on earth with his saints over the earth, and we rule and reign with him, and he rules over the nations with a rod of iron. You can't sit there and tell me he's ruling over with a rod of iron. A rod of iron is something that's used to correct. And if you think God is correcting the Muslims nations right now and all these other nations, and they're serving the Lord somehow, as all nations are, according to Zechariah, then you're kind of playing with things. Yes, God is sovereign, but when he comes to rule over those nations. The parousia, of course, is the day of the Lord. Now, let me go on. One thing that premillennial seem to make it complicated. Premillennial makes it complicated by inserting another age between this age and the age to come. They also insert an imaginary 7-year tribulation or 3.5 years. The only one we know of for sure was in 80, 66, and 70. Jesus said, "In this world you'll have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world." And that is simply not true, because this is what is describing the last 7.5 years, or the 3.5 years, the 42 months where the beast rules in Revelation. That has not happened yet, so it is still future. And so it's guided by that 4.5 years. You cannot say 80, 66, 70 was the tribulation period, because then you have to say that Jesus came, and Jeff is pretty much saying he's a preterist when he says that. Yes, people are living long lives and dying while Christ rules on earth because there were survivors. Why are people still, if Christ is reigning with them, why are people still dying? Because there were survivors. They were not changed and transformed at his coming. They were not believers. And we are living in the millennium now, and this is not the age to come, but we are still living in this present evil age. So here you're calling the millennial also the present evil age. You're calling it both things. And the whole description of the new heavens and earth with the lion is laying down with the wolf is not an evil age. Excuse me. Do you see that becomes inconsistent? He puts it down here right himself for this present evil age and the age come. We're still living in the present evil age, but it is also the millennial age. That's why. So why are people marrying and having children in that age? Because there are survivors. That's what he doesn't get. Jesus said they will not be married in the age to come. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given married. So yes, of course, the Christians are not getting married, but their survivors are the ones who get married and having children. He puts in there 5 questions in. Those who came to faith prior to the rapture, resurrection. First, say that this passage only pertains to, okay, and that's true. Okay, that passage pertains to the marriage and giving in marriage. Is about the people who are resurrected. I'm trying to follow his thoughts here. Others who experience the fullness of the glory of the kingdom are those who are martyred during the tribulation. They will be resurrected at the 7-year tribulation, at the second coming of Christ. These will go into the millennial also. They will be immortal, and they will not have children. True. Then, question 3. A third group of angels are those who have died before the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ. They too who have glorified bodies will not have children. And that's kind of a dispensational problem, of course. They say that the saints that beforehand were not raised up did not go to heaven until his second coming. So they kind of argue that those dead people who have died are still in Hades waiting for the resurrection. That's simply not true. And they're still waiting to be raised, and they too will have glorified bodies. But yes, I would say that all the Old Testament saints, of course, all of them will also be raised in this resurrection. They will not have children, so all of them are raised. Then those who come to faith after the rapture, after a second coming. So I'm straightening this out. The rapture does not become for the tribulation; it comes afterwards. So I disagree with the tribulation saints. Every Christian nobody was resurrected, so they're all tribulation. They will continue to live on into the millennium. They will marry and have children. That's the problem there, because the second coming, the resurrection happens at the end of it. So they, of course, will marry and have children, but when he comes at the end of the tribulation, they no longer. They are changed, so they're no longer. And there's no such thing as second-class Christians but that's what happens with dispensationalists. They put that in there. So some say that the Gentiles of blessed earth will also go into the millennial kingdom. Sheep and the goats, and they have the Jews have resisted. I've explained that, though. There were survivors. He doesn't believe that there are any survivors. Verse 6, question 6. Are there any survivors after the battle of Armageddon? Revelation says, the rest of those who come out of the fight against were killed with the sword coming out of Christ's mouth, i.e. the word of God, and the birds and the flesh. So if there are no survivors, how will they go into the millennial kingdom? And we've already demonstrated for Zechariah 12 that there were survivors, the people who did not actually come in to do the battling and fight. The survivors of these nations, the kids, the children, and all that, will grow up and continue as they were. Since probably was over to flee to the mountains. So now he's what he's doing is he's putting again Matthew 24, Mark, and the Olivet, and trying to combine that with dispensational thinking. Of course, they combine the two, since the Olivet is all fulfilled in Revelations, and that would be my different position. That the Olivet was completely fulfilled in 70 A.D. There is no sense of anything that it was talking about. It applies to the book of Revelations whatsoever. And that is my contention, along with a lot of other scholars, Greek and Hebrew scholars, are saying the same thing. So a lot of what he says there is just based on that misconception. And he's coming to, I believe he's coming to, okay. So no, there's nothing more. More than kingdom comes to them. Okay, so yeah, he goes on to explain his position, why he's, and of course it's a post-millennium conversation and viewpoint that he's stressing here. But I've demonstrated why it is not a post-millennial, why Christ comes at the end of that tribulation, the rapture happens, the saints are changed, and Christ comes to rule on earth. Based on Zechariah 12 and 14, the survivors come year after year to Jerusalem to worship the King. Revelations 20, Jerusalem, after his coming, after the beast is destroyed and thrown into, Jerusalem becomes the camp of the saints. It was not the camp of the saints in AD 70. The Christians fled. Here, after his coming, Jerusalem, again, the inhabitants were protected. They were defended and everything else, and it becomes the barracks or the camp of the saints, where the Christians now come back into and live with Christ, who is ruling over all of the nations. So I hope you got with everything else I said, I hope you understand that part of it. That's where the differences comes between me and Jeff Cunningham and some other people. We look at Revelations 20 as the millennial, beginning with the binding of Satan, where he is thrown into prison and he is no longer able to walk the earth. That's where I differ with the post who say he is just bound, and that began at the cross and is the whole church age. And that's why I disagree. That's why I see there was a third age, because the first resurrection begins after those people who are killed during the tribulation period by the beast are raised up. No, Nero was not the beast. That none of that fits that whole scenario, and that's another conversation for another day. So, wrapping this up, is all I'm trying to simply do is that we've got to take into consideration Zechariah 12 and 14, which I see most people never touch, never understand that those are second coming. Old Testament passages that have to be taken into account. Even Joel Sexton is not taking those things into account. So with that said, you can go back over it and look at it. If there's any other further questions, I'll be glad to answer. But again, Zechariah 12, 14, harmonize it with Revelations 20. That's what the goal is, a systematic theology. Harmonize things together. There is no sense where all the people in the whole earth is destroyed in that battle when Jesus comes. It says there are survivors. It is only the armies, and we have to pay attention to the wording. And a lot of people are just skipping over. Jeff, that's his main problem, is he's not looking exegetically at each verse. He's skipping over things, thinking that he understands the thought, the concept there, and is applying it to something, but not is really understanding that it's different. Revelations is nothing like before. All right, so with that said, thank you for listening. I know this is kind of long, but I'm sorry. But then, thanks for being patient. Go ahead to my channel and look at the other things, and I hope I titled them so that you can understand the different topics that I'm dealing with and talking about. So you guys have a good day, and we'll catch you again on the next time around.